They call me the poor one for 11 years, right to my face, at every single family function, until the day my grandfather's lawyer opened his briefcase in front of all of them and every smart expression in that room disappeared at once. My name is Simone. I was 31 years old the year my grandfather Elijah passed away, working double shifts as a home care nurse's aide while raising my 6-year-old daughter alone in a 2-bedroom apartment on the wrong side of town, according to my family anyway. My mother liked to remind me of that phrase constantly, the wrong side of town, as if the zip code on my mailbox somehow determined how much I was worth as a person. My older brother Marcus was a real estate broker who wore a different watch to every family dinner, each one more expensive than the last, and my younger sister Alicia had married into a family that owned 2 car dealerships, which meant she never let a single gathering pass without mentioning it at least 3 times. I was the poor one. That was my label, given to me sometime around my divorce, and it stuck to me the way labels do in families that need someone to look down on in order to feel better about themselves. It didn't matter that I worked 60 hours a week. It didn't matter that I was raising a daughter mostly by myself while going to school part-time for my nursing degree. In my family's eyes, struggle wasn't something you fought through, it was something you were, permanently, a category you got sorted into and never left. But my grandfather never once looked at me that way. Elijah had grown up sharecropping in rural Alabama before moving north with nothing but a duffel bag and a determination that never seemed to run out. He worked in a steel plant for 30 years, saved every dollar he could, and eventually bought up small rundown properties around the city one at a time, fixing them himself on weekends, renting them out, reinvesting everything. By the time I was old enough to understand what any of that meant, he owned an entire block of rental properties and a laundromat that had been in continuous operation since before I was born. He never talked about any of it. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation for as long as I could remember and drove a truck that backfired every time he started it. Every Thursday evening, without fail, I brought my daughter Nadia over to his house for dinner, just the 3 of us, while the rest of my family found reasons to be busy. We ate whatever he'd made, usually something simple, and afterward he'd sit on his porch with a glass of sweet tea and tell Nadia stories about Alabama, about the steel plant, about the years he spent building something out of nothing while people told him it couldn't be done. He never once asked me about money. He asked about my classes, about Nadia's school, about whether I was sleeping enough between my shifts. He was the only person in my family who seemed to understand that showing up mattered more than showing off. When he collapsed at the laundromat one Tuesday afternoon and the doctors found a tumor pressing against his spine, everything about my family's behavior toward him changed overnight, though not in the way you'd hope. Suddenly Marcus was calling him weekly, asking casual questions about the rental properties, about whether he'd thought about consolidating everything under one name for tax purposes. Suddenly Alicia was visiting with her husband in tow, walking through the laundromat like an appraiser, commenting on square footage and location value while my grandfather sat in a wheelchair a few feet away, still recovering from his first round of radiation. I didn't visit because I wanted anything. I visited because I was terrified of losing him, and because Nadia asked about him every single day, wanting to know when we'd see Grandpa Elijah again. I rearranged my work schedule twice to make sure I could drive him to his appointments. I learned to manage his pain medication schedule, learned which foods didn't upset his stomach after chemotherapy, learned how to help him from his wheelchair to the couch without hurting either of us in the process. My mother called it my calling, my little nursing hobby, in a tone that made it sound like something small and unserious, even though I was doing it for free, on top of a full-time job, on top of raising a child alone. "You're the only one who actually sits with me," he told me one evening, about 4 months before he died, his voice thinner than it used to be but his eyes just as sharp. "Your mother sends texts asking how I'm feeling. Marcus calls to ask about the properties. Alicia brought her husband to look at the laundromat like it was already for sale. But you, Simone, you just sit here with me. You don't want anything from me except my company. I told him that was because his company was the only thing worth wanting, and I meant it completely. He laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that turned into a coughing fit that scared Nadia until he waved her over and pulled her into a hug, telling her he was fine, just an old man being dramatic. The disease moved faster than anyone expected. Within 8 months of his diagnosis, he was gone, passing quietly in his sleep in his own bed, the way he'd told the hospice nurse he wanted it to happen, at home, in his own house, surrounded by the things he'd built with his own 2 hands. I found out because the hospice nurse called me first, not my mother, not Marcus, me, because I was the one listed as his primary contact, a fact that would become significant later, though none of us knew it yet. The funeral was arranged within the week, and my mother insisted on holding it at the largest funeral home in the city, the kind with marble floors and a chandelier in the main hall, the kind of place my grandfather would have found completely ridiculous for a man who spent his whole life avoiding unnecessary spending. She said appearances mattered, that half the church and half the old steel plant crowd would be attending, and she wanted everything to look a certain way. I understood, even then, that the funeral was never really going to be about him. It was going to be about how my family wanted to be perceived by everyone watching. I arrived early with Nadia, dressed in the only black dress I owned that still fit properly, wanting a few quiet minutes before the crowd arrived. Instead I found my mother, Marcus, and Alicia already there, clustered near the casket in expensive black clothing, their voices low but carrying that particular energy of people who were excited about something they weren't supposed to be excited about. I heard the word properties. I heard the word laundromat. I heard Alicia say something about how the block alone had to be worth well over $1 million now, given how much the neighborhood had developed. Well, look who decided to show up, my mother said when she noticed me, her eyes doing a quick sweep of my dress, my shoes, the second-hand purse I was carrying, the way she always did, cataloging everything about my appearance like she was pricing it. I wasn't sure you'd be able to get time off work for this. He was my grandfather, I said quietly, holding Nadia's hand a little tighter. Of course I came. Of course, Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. The poor one always shows up when there's a free meal involved. I felt my face go hot, the particular kind of heat that comes right before tears you're determined not to let fall. Nadia looked up at me, confused by the tension she could clearly sense but not yet fully understand, and I squeezed her hand and told her everything was fine, even though nothing about that moment felt fine at all. I found a seat near the back for the service and stayed there through the entire thing, Nadia's small hand resting in mine. The pastor spoke about my grandfather's faith, his generosity, the way he'd quietly helped fund the church's food pantry for over a decade without ever wanting credit for it, a fact I hadn't even known until that moment, and it made me ache with a fresh kind of grief realizing how much of him I still hadn't gotten the chance to know. My mother gave a eulogy about how close they had always been, about long talks and cherished memories, and I sat there trying to remember a single time in the past decade she'd mentioned visiting him outside of holidays, and I couldn't think of one. After the burial, everyone gathered at my mother's house for the repast, and the mood in that living room felt less like mourning and more like anticipation, the kind of charged, restless energy you feel in a waiting room before something important is about to be announced. A lawyer named Mr. Whitfield arrived about an hour in, carrying a leather briefcase, and I watched my entire family's posture shift the moment he walked through the door, shoulders straightening, conversations quieting, eyes tracking him across the room like he was carrying something they'd all been waiting a long time to see. Simone, my mother said, pulling me into the kitchen while Nadia stayed in the living room with my aunt, her voice dropping into the low, control tone she used whenever she wanted to manage a situation without technically arguing about it. I think it would probably be best if you and Nadia headed home before the will reading starts. This is really a matter for the family that's actually going to be handling the estate, and I don't want things to feel uncomfortable. I stared at her for a long moment, waiting for even a flicker of self-awareness to cross her face. It never came. "I am the family," I said. "I'm his granddaughter. I don't understand why that wouldn't include me." "Of course it does, technically," she said, in that exact tone people use when they've already decided your feelings don't factor into the outcome. "But let's be realistic, Simone. Your grandfather was a practical man. This is going to involve some complicated decisions about properties and finances, and honestly, given your situation, it might just be easier for everyone if you weren't in the room for it." My situation. As if being a single mother working double shifts was some kind of disqualifying condition rather than simply my life. Marcus wandered into the kitchen doorway at that point, drink in hand, and added his own contribution without even being asked. "Yeah, sis, maybe just take Nadia and head out. This part's really for people who are actually going to be involved in managing everything. No offense, but you know how it is." I wanted to leave. I wanted to gather my daughter and walk out of that house and never look back at any of them, to let them have their briefcase and their properties and their performance of grief and simply remove myself from the entire situation permanently. But something kept my feet rooted to that kitchen floor, some quiet stubbornness that had been building in me for 11 years of being called the poor one, of being talked over, of being managed instead of loved. "I'm staying," I said, and I walked back into the living room, took Nadia's hand, and sat down in one of the folding chairs someone had set up along the back wall. The room went quiet for a moment when I sat down. My mother exchanged a tight look with Marcus. Alicia rolled her eyes but said nothing further, already reaching for her phone to text her husband, who had left after the burial. Nobody wanted to make a scene in front of the lawyer, at least not yet. "Before I begin," Mr. Whitfield said, settling into the armchair that had clearly once belonged to my grandfather, the leather worn soft in the shape of a man who'd sat in it every evening for decades. "I need to explain that Elijah made significant revisions to his estate plan roughly a year ago. He came to my office alone, without informing any family members, and he specifically requested that these changes remain sealed and confidential until this exact moment." A ripple of unease passed through the room. My mother's fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Marcus shifted forward in his seat, his casual posture suddenly gone rigid. "A year ago," Mr. Whitfield continued, "your father also asked that I include a personal letter as part of this reading, written entirely in his own hand during one of his hospital stays. He asked that it be read exactly as written, without omission, regardless of how anyone in this room might react to it." He opened the briefcase, and the sound of that latch clicking open seemed to echo through the entire room. He pulled out a plain envelope, and from it, a folded sheet of paper, the handwriting on it visibly unsteady in the particular way that comes from a body failing while the mind inside remains completely clear. The room fell into a silence so total I could hear the old grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, the same clock my grandfather used to wind every Sunday while I sat at his kitchen table doing homework as a girl. "To my family," Mr. Whitfield read, his voice measured and calm. "If you are hearing this, then I am gone, and there are things I need to finally say that I never found the courage to say while I was still living." He paused, glancing briefly around the room before continuing. "For most of my life, I believed that if I built enough, saved enough, provided enough, my children would understand what truly mattered between us. I believed love didn't need to be proven, that it simply existed because we shared the same blood. I have come to understand, sitting in hospital rooms these past several months, that I was wrong about that, and I understood it far too late." My mother's hand had gone completely still around her wine glass. Nobody in that room moved. In the final 8 months of my life, I watched very carefully who actually showed up and who simply called to ask questions about my finances. I want to be honest about what I saw, because I think honesty is the only gift I have left to give any of you. I felt my chest tighten. I looked down at Nadia's small hand still resting in mine, not wanting to see the faces of the people sitting around me. Deborah, the letter continued, using my mother's name directly, and I watched her spine straighten as if she'd been struck. You visited me 4 times in 8 months. Each visit lasted less than 30 minutes, and in nearly every one, you asked about the properties before you asked how I was feeling. I want you to know that I noticed the order of your questions every single time. My mother's face had drained of nearly all its color. Marcus, the letter went on, and my brother's jaw tightened visibly, you called me weekly, which I appreciated, until I realized every single call eventually turned to a conversation about consolidating the rental properties under one name for tax purposes. You never once asked me how the pain medication was affecting my sleep. You asked me that only twice, and both times you pivoted to real estate within minutes. Marcus opened his mouth as if to object, then closed it again, saying nothing. Alicia, the letter continued, and my sister's confident posture finally cracked. You and your husband visited the laundromat while I was recovering from my second round of radiation, and you spent that visit discussing square footage and neighborhood development value while I sat in a wheelchair a few feet away. I want you to know I heard every word of that conversation, and I understood exactly what it meant. Alicia's face went rigid, her mouth pressed into a thin line, her eyes fixed on the floor. There was only one person who sat with me every single Thursday evening for years before I ever got sick, and who kept showing up every single week after, Mr. Whitfield read, his voice softening. Only one person who learned my medication schedule without ever being asked to, who helped me from my wheelchair to my own couch without ever making me feel like a burden, who brought her daughter to see me because she wanted Nadia to know her great-grandfather, not because she wanted anything from me in return. He looked up from the letter, and for a long moment his eyes found mine across the room. That person is my granddaughter, Simone. The room seemed to hold its breath entirely. My mother's mouth opened slightly and stayed that way. Marcus stared at the coffee table like it had suddenly become the only thing in the world worth looking at. Alicia's hand had frozen halfway to her phone. Mr. Whitfield continued reading. Simone never once asked me for anything in all these years, not when times were easy and not when times were hard for her, even during her divorce, even while raising her daughter mostly alone on a nurse's aide salary that I know for a fact barely covers her rent. She never mentioned my money. She never asked about my properties. She showed up because she wanted to be there, and that is worth more than anything a bank account could ever measure. I felt tears building behind my eyes, and this time I let them fall without trying to stop them. I know some of you will be angry when you hear what I have decided, the letter continued. I know some of you will say it isn't fair, that Simone somehow didn't earn what the rest of you believe you were entitled to simply by being my children. But I ask each of you to consider one honest question before that anger takes hold completely. What did you actually give me in these final months, beyond a phone call asking about my finances? What did you sacrifice? Where were you on the nights the pain kept me awake until dawn, and why isn't the answer to that question sitting comfortably with you right now? My mother's expression had gone rigid, unreadable, her eyes fixed somewhere past the lawyer's shoulder. Marcus was gripping the arm of his chair hard enough that his knuckles had gone pale. For that reason, Mr. Whitfield read, slowing his voice to give proper weight to each word, I'm leaving the majority of my estate to my granddaughter, Simone. This includes the house on Curtis Avenue, the entire rental property block on the east side, the laundromat and its business accounts, and the remainder of my financial holdings, totaling approximately $2.9 million. The numbers seemed to physically press against every person in that room at once, a weight none of us had been prepared to feel. To my children, I leave $150,000 each, along with my sincere hope that this gift encourages some genuine reflection on what it actually means to be present for someone you claim to love, rather than simply asking after what they might eventually leave behind. Mr. Whitfield folded the letter and set it gently down on the coffee table. "There is one final line," he said quietly. Elijah specifically requested it be read separately, after a brief pause. He picked the paper back up. "Simone, if you're listening to this, I want you to know that I saw you, every Thursday evening, every hospital visit, every quiet moment you never thought I was paying attention to. Take care of Nadia. Teach her what showing up actually looks like, the way you taught me it still existed in this family, even after everything. This isn't charity, and it certainly isn't pity. It's simply the truth, finally spoken aloud the way it should have been years ago. Thank you for loving a poor sharecropper's son who had nothing left to offer you except love in return." The silence that followed felt endless, though it was probably only a handful of seconds. Then my mother's voice cut through it, sharp and unsteady. "This has to be some kind of mistake," she said, standing so abruptly her chair scraped hard against the hardwood floor. "He was heavily medicated for months. He wasn't thinking clearly when he made these decisions, and I think everyone in this room understands that. Elijah was evaluated by 2 independent physicians at the time these changes were finalized," Mr. Whitfield replied, calm and unhurried, as though he'd anticipated this exact reaction weeks ago. "Both confirmed he was of entirely sound mind. The evaluations are included in the estate file, should you wish to review them with your own attorney." "This is completely unfair," Marcus said, rising to his feet so quickly the coffee cup on the side table nearly tipped over. "She gets everything because she showed up a few evenings a week. We're his actual children." "He was my grandfather too," I said quietly, and it was the first thing I'd said aloud since the letter had begun. My voice shook, but I kept talking anyway. "You called him weekly to ask about tax consolidation. Where were you on the nights he couldn't sleep because of the pain? Where were you when he needed someone to actually sit with him, not just talk to him about his properties?" Marcus's jaw worked silently, and he had no answer for that, and every single person in that room understood it, including him. "You don't get to stand here and act wounded," I continued, feeling something inside me finally break loose after 11 years of swallowing every small cruelty, every dismissive comment, every moment of being labeled the poor one in a family that measured worth in bank statements rather than presence. "None of you sat with him. None of you learned his medication schedule. None of you even asked the right questions when you visited. And now you want to stand here and act like something was stolen from you. You've always thought you were better than us," my mother said, her voice trembling with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite shame but sat somewhere uncomfortably close to both. "Playing the devoted granddaughter, making the rest of us look bad by comparison every chance you got." "I wasn't trying to make anyone look bad," I said, and I meant every single word of it. "I was trying to be there for a dying man who raised half of this family and never once asked for anything in return. That's all this ever was for me." My mother finally sat back down, her hands trembling slightly, her voice dropping into something quieter and more dangerous than the outburst before it. "We will be contesting this will. I hope you understand that clearly. No court in this state is going to uphold something that disinherits actual children in favor of one grandchild." Mr. Whitfield, entirely unbothered, reached into his briefcase and produced a second folder. "You're welcome to try," he said evenly, though I should mention that Elijah anticipated this exact possibility as well. "The will includes a no contest clause. Any beneficiary who formally challenges this document in court automatically forfeits their inheritance entirely, including the $150,000 each of you has currently been left. I'd strongly advise consulting your own legal counsel before proceeding, but I can assure you, Elijah was extremely thorough in his planning." The room fell quiet again, though this time the silence carried a different weight, the sound of anger slowly recalculating itself against risk, of greed suddenly being forced to negotiate with consequence. I stood up slowly, Nadia's hand still in mine, my legs unsteady beneath me. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the satisfaction I might have expected walking into that living room hours earlier. Mostly I felt hollow and exhausted and strangely sad, like a truth had finally been spoken aloud that none of us would ever be able to take back, no matter how badly some of us wanted to. I don't want a war over this, I said, looking around the room at faces that had once felt like family and now felt like strangers wearing clothes I recognized. He didn't leave me this because he wanted to punish anyone. He left it to me because he trusted me. I'm not going to turn this into something uglier than it already is just because the rest of you are angry about it. How generous of you, my mother said bitterly, though the words came out weaker than she'd probably intended. I didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything left to say that would change how she felt about me, and honestly, after 11 years of trying, I was finally too tired to keep attempting it. I left my mother's house that evening and drove straight to Grandpa Elijah's place on Curtis Avenue, the house that now technically belonged to me, though it didn't feel real yet and wouldn't for a long time. I sat with Nadia on the porch in his old chair, the one with the worn armrest shaped by decades of use, and I let myself cry properly for the first time since he'd died. Not because of the money. Not because of the fight. I cried because I miss him, plainly and completely, the particular kind of missing that leaves a hole shaped exactly like the person who's gone. A few days later, going through his things, I found a small metal cash box tucked in his closet, and inside it, beneath all receipts and property deeds, a stack of photographs I never knew existed. Nadia and me on his porch, laughing at something out of frame. Me helping him from his wheelchair, my face focused with concentration. Me asleep in a chair beside his hospital bed during one of his longer stays, my hand still resting near his on the blanket. On the back of one, in his shaky handwriting, he had written a single line. "This is what family actually looks like." I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time holding those photographs, understanding for the first time just how closely he had been watching, even during moments I thought had passed by unnoticed. In the weeks that followed, my family mostly stopped speaking to me altogether. My mother sent one final message calling me ungrateful and manipulative, which felt darkly ironic given everything that had actually happened. Marcus stopped answering my calls entirely. Alicia posted vague messages online about greed and betrayal that everyone who knew our family understood were aimed directly at me. I didn't fight any of them on it. I didn't try to defend myself or explain or beg for forgiveness. I hadn't actually done anything wrong to need. I used part of the inheritance to finish my nursing degree without working 2 jobs simultaneously for the first time in years, and I moved Nadia and myself into the house on Curtis Avenue, the one with the porch where she used to listen to her great-grandfather's stories about Alabama. I kept the laundromat running, kept on the 2 longtime employees who had worked there for over a decade and who cried harder at his funeral than any of my own family had. Running that business taught me things about him I never fully understood while he was alive, the quiet discipline it took to build something from absolutely nothing, the patience required to keep showing up every single day for 30 years without ever needing anyone to notice. Some evenings I still sit on that porch with Nadia, watching the sun go down the way he used to, and I tell her stories about him, about Alabama, about a man who spent his whole life being underestimated and quietly proved everyone wrong anyway. I want her to understand that being called poor never actually meant anything about who I was, that the people who used that word against me for 11 years were simply measuring worth with the wrong instrument entirely. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about the inheritance, about the way it fractured what was left of my family. I've turned that question over more nights than I can count, usually after Nadia's asleep and the house finally goes quiet. And the answer I keep arriving at is always the same. I didn't fracture my family. Their own choices did that long before any letter was ever written, long before any briefcase was ever opened in that living room. The will didn't create the distance between us. It simply revealed a distance that had already been growing quietly for years. One dismissive comment at a time, one skip visit at a time, one calculated question about property values at a time. My grandfather spent the final months of his life mostly surrounded by people who called to ask about his finances, and one granddaughter who simply refused to let him face the end of his life without someone who actually loved him nearby. In the end, he saw the difference between the two with total clarity, even when the rest of my family apparently couldn't see it in themselves at all. And maybe that's the part of this story that still keeps me up some nights, more than the inheritance itself ever could. It was never about the money for him. It was about who showed up when there was nothing being offered in return, who sat beside someone in their hardest moments simply because that's what love actually requires. So I'll leave you with the same question I still don't have a clean answer for myself. If you had been standing in my family's position, watching wealth you believe was yours slip away to someone you had spent years quietly calling poor, would you have been able to admit the truth about your own absence? Or would you have done exactly what they did, and blamed the person who actually showed up instead of ever facing the person staring back at you in the mirror?